Hello and welcome to Everyday Anarchism, the show that finds anarchism, cooperation, non-domination, mutual aid in your everyday life. I am your host, Graeme Culbertson. This week I'm bringing in another Graeme Robertson, who is an expert on Ukraine and Ukrainian identity, to talk about the complexities that are emerging in the ideas of nationality, identity, imperialism, the nation state, billionaires, oligarchs, all of the stuff that we mostly need to put aside as we support Ukraine in their conflict with Russia, but that also it will be good for those of us who are not experts on Ukraine to understand as we seek to understand this conflict and as we seek to make sense of the world that will exist whenever this conflict ends. I will say, Graeme and I just started chatting, and then all of a sudden we were doing the interview without noticing it. So I hit record kind of late into the interview, so you're just sort of thrown into the middle. All you need to know is that we were talking about Ukrainian identity and the idea of the nation state, and the rest of it, I think, will go from there. Before we talk a little bit about the recent history of Ukraine, I can go ahead and say, and you can agree that I'm in touch with people in Ukraine, and this kind of nuance is not happening now, and indeed should not in this moment. But I am a big believer that you can, even in this moment of clarity, you can lay the groundwork for the problems that this moment of clarity is going to create. It's going to create a problem if we fail to understand the complexities of Ukraine and the Ukrainian situation in 18 months. And it also creates, my thing is, Graeme, is sometimes these moments of clarity create opportunities for the right wing. Um, you know, this, I've been hearing rumors that I was dismissing about the neo-Nazis in certain parts of Ukraine and their flags being flying against Russia and things like that. And I just ignored that because I assumed it wasn't true. And only in the last 48 hours have I learned it is true. And now the New York Times is covering it. And it just makes you look really bad if you say, Putin says that there are Nazis in Ukraine, but this is ridiculously untrue. Zelensky is Jewish. Putin is the real Nazi, which is, I think, true. But then the right winger can send you a picture of a neo-Nazi flag flying in Ukraine, and you just said that there's no truth to this at all, and no one could believe it, and there's no Nazis in Ukraine. And in fact, there are. And then you look like an idiot, and then you've lost clarity. In fact, through the lack of nuance.
Right. So, I mean, the nuance there is that, yes, there are Nazis in Ukraine. There are Nazis in Norway. There are Nazis.
There's Nazis everywhere. There's fucking Nazis everywhere.
Were the Nazis in power in Ukraine? No. Right. And were they in power before the Russian invasion? No. Were there far right elements? Let's go to the Euromaidan. Right? And there was a big and quite toxic debate in academic circles within Ukraine itself over the role of the far right in the Euromaidan. Was this a fascist coup, essentially? Right? And the truth lies in the fact that there were far right representatives on the Maidan. They were principally involved in the violent conflict with the state. The state, they were the ones that were fighting back when the Berkut came to repress the protesters. And a lot of those people were a very key part of the assault on the government buildings that led Yanukovych to flee. Right? So unquestionably there was far right participation and significant far right participation in the fighting part. Then we came to the elections afterwards, and those parties got less than 2% of the vote. And they disappeared effectively as a parliamentary force. Some people who had emerged from that movement hung around security circles in the government, but they were not in charge and they were not in control. Right? And all of that became a very hard conversation to have, because as soon as you you acknowledge that their existence. For far right people then, that somehow justifies this right wing argument that that Ukraine is a fascist country and the fascists are in charge. And it's that leap that's absurd, right? It's utterly absurd to say I can send you pictures of neo Nazis in Ukraine. There's video all over the internet of neo Nazis in Ukraine. There's even like British journalists undercover with the Nazis, right? Kind of thing. That's all there, but it's irrelevant, to the bigger picture, and it's the attempt to mainstream that extreme is where the madness lies.
Yeah, absolutely. Another way to put it, and you and I chatted about this a little bit before we started recording, is, everyone is saying, oh, Ukraine is a country, it's a real country. Don't believe the lies that it's not a real country. Well, Ukraine is a made up, imaginary country. And in that respect, is like every other country. That is something about countries that the standard nation state or liberal or UN or political sovereignty idea that has emerged into the mainstream, at least in the 20th, if not going back to the 19th century, that countries are this real thing. There's a nation, which is an ethnicity, which is a group of people who are bonded together by history, language, religion, food, and then the state is just their sovereignty, the sovereignty of those people turned into a government. This is a total fiction. It's a total fiction in Ukraine. It's a total fiction everywhere else, though. It's a fiction in France and Germany and Argentina and wherever you find it. It's always a fiction. And then if you want to say, well, Ukraine is disqualified as a country because there are fascists in the government, you only have to go back to Charlottesville, the Unite the Right rally, the election of Donald Trump, and say, well, if countries are disqualified from the support of the United States of America, well, then the United States of America fits in that group of countries, because there are people who might qualify as Nazis in our government, and certainly were in our government in the Trump administration. What was that guy's name? Gorka, the guy who was
Sebastian Gorka,
yeah, who was actually a Nazi, like actually was a neo-Nazi and was in the U.S. government. So the reason why I brought you in today, and thank you so much for coming. Also, today is the day of the founding of the Paris Commune. It won't be airing on the founding of the Paris Commune, but congratulations, Commune Day, everyone. Is because I wanted, I'm seeing the narrative in the same way that the narrative around, say, something like Black Lives Matter is an utterly simplistic narrative that is 100% true. I was seeing the same thing. It's both 100% true and it's far too simplistic around Ukraine. So the sense of like, for my part and for you part, the Graemes are united on this one. The war against Putin and his forces and his invasion of Ukraine is 100% justified, is 100% good. There's no argument against it. What disturbed me is that people were making an argument against it in terms of things like national sovereignty and Ukraine is a country and all of these things that I think people are quite critical of when they're talking about the UK or when they're talking about America, but they were blindly accepting them in the case of Ukraine. And so I want to say you can be 100% against Putler, as the Ukrainian anarchist I'm in touch with is calling Putin, without having to accept a sort of 19th century definition of the nation state, which most of my friends are very skeptical of most of the time. So I brought you in, Graeme Robertson, if you don't mind introducing yourself, and then we'll just continue this conversation that we threw our listeners into the middle of.
Great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here and to chat with you, Graeme. I'm Graeme Robertson. I'm the director of the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies at UNC Chapel Hill, and I'm a political scientist. I've been working in Russia and Ukraine and former Yugoslavia since back in the late 1980s, and focus these days very much on Russia and Ukraine and questions of identity.
Questions of identity. So we can, let me just define the nation state very briefly. For those of you who are not political scientists or haven't studied political science, just the idea behind the nation state, I've already alluded to this, is the idea that there is a group of people that have something in common. This is the nation. And then the government should be run by that group of people. That is the state. And the nation state originates as a liberal or even leftist project against imperialism. So when you think about the nation state in the 19th century, the idea is, hey, why should some rich guy who speaks German be in charge of these peasants in what is now Italy just because his last name is Habsburg? So the nation state is an idea of resistance against imperialism. But at this point in the 21st century, I believe the tide has turned against the nation state in many ways, at least on the left and even in liberal circles, because the nation state seems to include some form of internal exclusion. So you get a sort of form of internal imperialism, often against people who do not count as part of that nation, who do not have the shared history identity. So Black people in America, Jews everywhere besides Israel, etc., etc. These people should be denied full rights because they are not part of the people and they do not deserve sovereignty. And it's in light of that question and problem that I wanted to talk to you. It really is a problem of identity and politics about what's happening in Ukraine. Sorry, I wanted to give you a chance to respond to any of that if you want to.
I think there was a lot there. I mean, I guess maybe is it useful to at this point to sort of talk about the construction of contemporary Ukraine?
Absolutely.
Years, right?
So since nations are made, you get lucky when you're here and you can see it having been made in the past 30 years. So tell us about the making of Ukraine.
Yeah, so without going back into the story usually begins in Kiev in the 11th century and all of that, and the kind of twos and fro's of the Russian Empire and independent statelets that emerge and Cossack hitminates and all of that stuff. We're starting at the end of the post-Soviet period, right? So the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, as it was shaped, was a function. Covered the territory that it did as a function of Soviet conquest at the end of the Second World War, and then internal decisions in the 1960s under Khrushchev as to which territories would be in Ukraine and which would be in Russia. And this is essentially Crimea. And so when Ukraine becomes independent in 1990, at the end of 1991, it covers a range of different territories and peoples. There are majority Ukrainian-speaking parts. There are majority Russian-speaking parts. There are parts with large Russian ethnicity concentrations, such as Crimea, but there's also Tatars who make up a pretty significant population in Crimea. So there's a lot of variety. One thing that they are pretty much all agreed on at the end is in the referendum on independence at the end of the Soviet period was that every region voted majority for independence from the USSR. And then what happens over time is you have essentially an economic crisis that's much worse and much deeper in Ukraine than in Russia, where it was really pretty terrible. And Ukraine starts to become politically divided between East and West, roughly, the North and South. But you can carve it in different ways, but you get a kind of more pro-Russia East and Crimea, and a more kind of anti-Russian, really, rather than pro-Western part of Ukraine in the West. And if you look at Ukrainian elections, all the way through up until the election of Zelensky in 2017, you see the sharp divide between in the electoral map. And that's sort of the reality of Ukrainian statehood up until the Orange Revolution of 2003 and the Euromaidan in 2013, 2014. These are attempts to rebel against the extraordinarily corrupt and poor and weak nature of the Ukrainian state, which essentially in the post-Soviet years gets cannibalized by oligarchs who control the main assets and the wealth in the country. The Ukrainian state gets kind of hollowed out and gets basically largely privatized. by different groups of oligarchs, the same way as it did in Russia around the same time.
I just need to point out again, also in America. I mean, I'm in contact with a guy in Ukraine, and he says, and this is true, this neoliberal oligarchization of Ukraine is horrible. It's worse than it is in Russia, and it's much worse in Russia than it is in a place like London. But the oligarchization, I need to stop saying that, is pretty bad in London. As we can see now that the tide has turned against not oligarchs in general, but Russian oligarchs, London is in some ways has been run for the benefit of Russian oligarchs. So I don't want to suggest that this is a Ukrainian problem. My understanding is it could be worse in Ukraine than anywhere else in the entire world. But it's pretty bad in London, and it's also pretty bad in New York City.
Well, in the United States, in North Carolina, right, where and most of the states where people buy legislation, right? They call it lobbying, they call it campaign contributions, but the effect, the difference is that it's legal, right? It's legal. So it's not corruption because it's legal.
Yeah, my comrade in Ukraine was saying, "Oh, you have to pay this huge bribe to defend a PhD dissertation," and my response was, "Well, yeah, there's no bribes here in America, but you do have to be wealthy to defend a PhD dissertation or go into tons of debt." And in some ways, the legality of it doesn't make it better. It makes it worse. Oh, this is all above board. Oh, well, you have an undemocratically elected president, but that's fine because he won the electoral college, and that's just how the system works. It's undemocratic, but it's the system, so you just have to accept it, and it's all legal and above board.
Yeah, yeah. So the legality is always sort of amused me.
Well, now you're talking like an anarchist, right? Because this is the idea. It's like, oh, well, corruption is bad unless it's legal, and then corruption is good because laws are good.
Yeah, I mean, I think whereas having good laws is important. Having laws that are bought by private interests is bad, right? So there's lots of different ways to be bad.
Yeah, and I would say, I'm not against the idea of laws. Although it's certainly, some utopia, who would want laws? But I'm against the idea that if you have laws, then things are good. Well, I'm not sure laws are necessary. That would be the anarchist position, but they're definitely not sufficient.
Yeah.
Many countries have legally guaranteed universal health care. That is a law. Very few countries that have that law actually have anything resembling universal health care. It's another form of this fiction. I'm sorry, I'm getting us off of Ukraine and back into anarchism.
So the Orange Revolution basically is an attempt by a president to anoint his own successor, and a successor who represented particularly the city of Donetsk in the east of Ukraine, and who was very much associated with mafia clans in Donetsk, and was resented by many politicians and ordinary people in Ukraine as a sort of an annexation of Kiev by Donetsk. So the Donetsk mafia takes over the whole country, right? And this was the objection to Yanukovych's appointment or fraudulent election in 2004. And so there's a big uprising against it. Long story short, Yanukovych gets disbarred by the Supreme Court, and Yushchenko becomes the president. He's probably the rightfully elected one. But not much happens, right? In terms of this big civil society movement that had grown up around the Orange Revolution doesn't take power. What takes power is another set of oligarchs. This time, Western Ukrainian oligarchs, and under a kind of veneer of Ukrainian nationalism that Yushchenko pushes. He then loses an election to Yanukovych. So Yanukovych actually comes back and becomes president in a relatively free and fair election. And then the next sort of cutting point is the Euromaidan revolution of 2013, when Yanukovych he's been trying to balance between Russia and the West for the whole time, and then the contradictions of that he gets overwhelmed by, basically, and he backs out of a deal to join the single market, or at least begin the process of joining the European single market. He backs off of that, and there's big protests against it. People see this in Kiev. It begins with intellectuals in Kiev. See this as a clear distinction, a clear choice for Russia over a Western path. There's a revolution. It's a long story. Revolutions are long stories, but long story short, there's a revolution. The Russians annex the Crimean Peninsula, and they support what are at least initially indigenous uprisings in Donetsk and Lugansk. By indigenous, I don't mean the real masses out on the streets fighting. I mean local gangsters and business people probably funding the operations and leading them. And then you end up with this territory that's taken from Ukraine, which is Crimea, and then a territory which is contested in a continuing war with Russia. That's from 2014 until today. The effect of this inside Ukraine is to really strengthen the civic identity in Ukraine. Before, the political divide had been somewhere along the lines of ethnicity and somewhat along the lines of language use. But after the Euromaidan revolution, it becomes much easier to be a pro-Ukraine, patriotic Ukrainian and be a Russian speaker, because there's kind of a rallying around this Ukrainian identity. And that's sort of been where we were when the presidential elections of 2017 come along, and Zelensky becomes the first president who's a Russian speaker, a native Russian speaker, to run for the presidency, but in a kind of pro-Ukrainian platform, and against kind of a much more exclusivist version of Ukrainian identity represented by Poroshenko, who is the defeated candidate. And so it becomes this idea of a civic identity, a civic Ukrainian identity, is greatly strengthened, and actually really sort of, you might think of it as being born in the Maidan in 2013. If it's not born there, it certainly grows there a lot, and becomes pretty mainstream by the time the Russians invade last month.
Okay, that's fantastic. So that's a level of nuance that I didn't realize. So the suggestion is, if we're looking for this moment when the fiction of Ukraine, the imaginary of Ukraine becomes real, it's in this sort of Benedict Anderson sense. It's the moment when it becomes believed by a mass of people. There's no, the idea can be out there, and it's the belief that creates a country, that creates a nation state. And so after all this time where the war was between one part of Ukraine, which is sort of Western focused, and another part of Ukraine, which is more Russian focused, and this divide happened regionally and ethnically. In the Maidan, there's a sense that it's time to stop arguing about whether we are going to be, divided, or whether we're going to be a Russian country. But there's a sense that we can be a country, we can be a state. It can be sort of a state nation, as you described, although I don't think we recorded that part, which is where everyone can sign up to this Ukrainian identity and wave the flag without the connotations of language and ethnicity and the exclusiveness of a nation that I talked about earlier. Yeah. And this presumably, and this is again where I need your expertise, looks like a pretty unalloyed good to Western liberals who do not think of themselves, or at least as of 2 months ago, did not think of themselves as this thing called the West, which was in a war with this thing called Russia, but thought of themselves in this sort of Fukuyama end of history. We have this lovely thing called liberal democracy and capitalism, and it's good, and everyone should want it. And this is a big victory because the Ukrainians left behind both, ethnic nationalism and Russian imperialism and are just going to join, quote, the free world. And that leads to all of the celebration of Zelensky now in the West. Does that accord with your sense of it?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, what really happens is that, and you put it really well, the Russian option dies. Russian behavior over the annexation of Crimea and the war in east of Ukraine effectively kills off the idea for the vast majority, not for everybody. Obviously, there's no unanimity anywhere, right? But for the vast majority of people, it kills off any idea of there being a Russian united, a Russian customs union, for example. Right? If you ask people in surveys, do they prefer the EU or the Russian customs union? Up until the Maidan, people often said both, even though that's not actually legally possible. Or they preferred, kind of one or the other, depending on where they live. After the Maidan, there's a big switch. That whole Russian customs union idea is dead. People are still divided as to whether they want to join the EU or NATO. There's more support for NATO than the EU. There's divisions. Some of the more nationalist Ukrainians don't want a piece of those international organizations either. But the Russian option dies, essentially. And there becomes a much more unified view of Ukraine as a Western-facing country.
Excellent. And now we got to do a little realpolitik, which it just looks like realpolitik on the page if you're reading it, but it's a German word. It essentially means foreign policy is not about ideals. It's not about values. It's about power and strategy. And this leads us to Putin's decision. At least this is the standard decision. And again, I'll let my expert guest weigh in on this. The standard description of why Putin invades. So in the one sense, Putin invades to strengthen his power at home, which Professor Robertson wrote an article about in the Washington Post. But he also invades because if the West doesn't see Ukraine joining the EU and the NATO as a blow in the war against Russian strategic power, the West sees it as the advancement of these good values that are good and should ideally take over the entire world. Putin very much, at home and abroad, has a narrative that he is defending the Russian Empire, which is a recent invention, is 30 years old, and is also 1,000 years old, depending on how you want to count it, against the encroaching forces of the West. And if EU and NATO institutions are in Ukraine, that means that this encroaching counter-empire, this US-backed counter-empire called the West, is in striking distance of Moscow. And so Putin says, I cannot abide this. This is realpolitik. This is strategy, not ideals. And then he puts this ideological underpinning of like, oh, well, these people are actually Russian. That's why Crimea and Donbass, this takes us back to the idea of nationalism. These people do not belong to this Ukrainian state because they are, in fact, my people, or you could say our people, even though Putin, I think, does not distinguish between himself and the Russian Empire.
Yeah, that's a really astute way to put it. I think essentially, the way I would put it is the expansion of NATO creates a security dilemma for Russia, right? And they're getting closer to Russia's borders. This weakens Russian security clearly. We say, the U.S. says, oh no, it doesn't, because we have good intentions.
We're not ever going to invade Russia. No Western country will ever invade Russia. Not like Napoleon did it, and also Hitler, and also tons of times. That's never going to happen. We're really nice now, and so you are the only bad actor here. So if there's missiles in Ukraine and you're upset about it, that's your fault.
Yeah. So that's entirely, it's entirely reasonable to think that the Russians and well beyond Putin in the foreign policy establishment, in the military establishment, even amongst the broader citizenry, could interpret NATO expansion as a security threat, because it was. The question is this a reasonable action? Is the invasion of Ukraine a reasonable action in response to that security threat? Even if you take all morality out of it, it's not, because all that you've done is you've created a united Europe, you've created, a real security threat, perception of security threat on the other side, which will lead them to arm more, which will lead you to have to arm more. It's the classic security dilemma situation.
Yeah, so you talked about this in your Washington Post article. It is very clear to us now, and honestly was, I think, clear to most of us before, that Vladimir Putin saved, quote, the West as a concept, as a military industrial force. There were many things holding back the West from being this unified thing. There was, for one thing, the lack of the sense that either Russia or China were this existential threat that needed to be fought against. That has changed now. Russia seems like an existential threat. Just talk to any European country that is near Ukraine, wondering if they are next. And then the other thing was there was a lot of distrust of the United States, going all the way back to neoconservatives invading Iraq and Afghanistan. But certainly after Trump's election, there was this sense that the U.S. was no longer a trusted partner because either A, they really were the imperialists that Putin was calling them, and they're quite happy to take imperialist actions in non-white countries that have lots of natural resources. And you can imagine him deciding that Russia fits that bill. I can't imagine that, but you can imagine a Russian deciding that. And the other thing is that America is just in decline. It's in decay. It's electing TV hosts to be president, and no serious country can have a TV personality as president. And America's done that a couple of times. Yeah, that's a Zelensky joke also. And so you just shouldn't sign up for Team West, Team USA, Team Liberal Democracy versus the evil empire. And the person who never signs up for this deal is Angela Merkel, and she's from the eastern part of Germany. And that, Germany is not going to put its money with Team Western military is gone now. And that seems like that must have been Putin's greatest fear, is the US, Germany, and the rest of the West in their orbit. I can imagine Japan starting to arm themselves not only against China, but also against Russia, which the Russians should have learned not to get into a war with Japan by now, I feel like.
So we've been saying for a long time that Putin's key goal is to divide the West, is to undermine unity in the United States, is to undermine the EU, and there's this sort of Gestalt moment that happens in 2008, 2007, when the Russian foreign policy establishment has been pretty sanguine about the expansion of the EU, opposed to the expansion of NATO, but pretty sanguine about the EU. And then they realize that, wait a minute, the EU is not just an economic project. The EU is a political, cultural project. And we're going to be excluded from this political, cultural project. It's going to basically unite everybody else in a single cultural realm against our vision of the Russian cultural realm. Right? And that's bad. We want to keep it divided. It's funny that it took them so long to work it out, because the Europeans have been saying that since the European Coal and Steel Community was founded in the 1950s, explicitly as a political project. But the Russians caught up to that really late, and so they start to realize this, and then they start to oppose very bitterly any expansion of the EU as well as of NATO. And that sort of idea that breaking up the EU and undermining it, paying for Brexit, as the Russians, made significant contributions to the Conservative Party in the UK and to supporting Brexit. We actually did an interview in the Putin versus the People book. We did an interview with Alexander Dugin, who is this right-wing fascist ideologue in Russia, who had a certain amount of influence in the Russian government. My co-author Sam Green did the interview, and it was in London, in the very fancy West London home of a British financier.
Right? There you go, precisely.
Conducted, Dugin wanted to speak in English, though he doesn't speak English all that well. The whole thing was this microcosm of this idea that Russia was trying to undermine the EU. And what Putin has done is he has, Ukraine, the EU is now like talking about admitting Ukraine, which would never have happened in my lifetime, because the rules and the financial regulations and the economic rules would just make it very, very hard for Ukraine to adapt on that, even on a 20-year time frame. And so if that was really if that was what Putin was trying to do before, then he has, failed epically in his foreign policy. And so I've moved from being someone who tended to see Russian behavior through the lens of opposing NATO and the security dilemma and these sort of realpolitik factors, to thinking, well, either this was a dramatic intelligence failure, which is possible, but like an intelligence failure so large that it would have taken you 5 minutes on the street in Kiev to have worked out that the Ukrainians were going to resist. And if you couldn't make it, you could have worked it out online in 10. So I don't know that if it's even possible that there was an intelligence failure of that scale. It's possible, but I find it hard to believe. In other words, so what's the other explanation? Well, the explanation is this really is an imperial project, and it's not about Russian security at all. It's about increasing the size and the reach of the Russian Empire. And that's not a perspective really that I had. I had entertained it, but I didn't really think it until February.
Yeah, I think that makes complete sense. I think it's this is an old truism, but Russia is not an empire without Ukraine. Because there's lots of reasons, but the food comes from Ukraine, and at some point, I'm going to cover Nestor Makhno on this show. So for those of you who do not know, anarchism has broken out a few times in the past couple hundred years, and it's been more or less successful. Makhno was very successful militarily, and then it usually gets written out of the history books. For example, there was just an article about the history of Ukraine in the New York Review of Books, and it talked about the war between the White Russians, the Red Russians, and the Ukrainians. And it did not say, and it named generals in every single group except for the Ukrainians. And with my, anarchist conspiracy hat on, it says, well, actually, there's, the Ukrainians were united under a flag, and it was a black flag. They certainly weren't completely united, but neither were the whites or the reds weren't united either. But they had a very effective military, and they fought very well, and they were anarchists, and that simply could not stand for the Soviets. There could not be a USSR with a friendly anarchist Ukraine, and I think the anarchist Ukraine would have been friendly with the USSR. There had to be a Soviet empire with Ukraine run out of the Kremlin, or there was no Soviet empire. So Makhno had to go, and as is often the case, the anarchists fight the fascists, and then the Reds sweep in and defeat the anarchists after both sides are exhausted. That's what happens in the Spanish Civil War, and that's what happens in Makhno's Ukraine also. The Reds wait until both of the other sides are divided, and then they send the tanks in. So there's my bit of anarchist history and propaganda related to that.
When Homage to Catalonia, George Orwell's book about the Spanish Civil War, and
yes,
all the time you were talking, that's what I was thinking about.
It's I'm certainly not. I certainly do not know the Makhno story as well as the story of the Spanish Civil War, but it seems to have roughly the same arc. Yeah, except that the fascists win in Spain instead of the Reds. So when you're thinking about Russian Empire, and this is why I brought up Napoleon, I saw a tweet recently that some Russia expert had said, this is just how Russia is. It always has an autocrat, and it always wants to have an empire. I just sort of made that case. But I do want to make the opposite case, which is dating back at least to the late 18th century and the Napoleonic Wars, but probably going much farther back. There is another reading of this, which is Russia is always trying to be some sort of a state, and much like Afghanistan, it is always being invaded and destroyed, both from the East, historically from the East, but over the past 200 years from the West. How many times has the West, the quote West, if you think of it as a unified thing, which I often do not, but as Russians can, it doesn't matter if it's Napoleon or Hitler. Either way, it's that Western thing invading Russia. And if you do not build an empire, you are just Afghanistan, a place that can never have a state and can never have even anything resembling sovereignty. So I did want to get that sort of realpolitik interpretation in front of the listeners. So if you think, okay, this is an imperial project, Graeme, what you're suggesting it is, it's an imperial project that's designed to not become Afghanistan. And no one wants to be Afghanistan. That is a very reasonable position. Whether or not that's a true fear in 2022, I have no idea. I'm not that well informed, but it's a fear based in history and legitimate.
So I would put a slightly different spin on it, because I don't think that the invasion of Ukraine is in any way an existential question for Russia. I think
okay, but I want to hear this answer. But first, is it reasonable to say that Putin could consider it an existential question for Russia, even though that's not right?
if fortunately we don't live in the 4 inches between Vladimir Putin's ears, because what goes on in there, is scary and hard to know. What he thinks, I don't know, but there's not a rational story that paints this as an existential threat.
Good.
Putin has created an existential threat by doing it, right? An existential threat to him personally. It's not inconceivable that he finishes this whole thing hanging from a lamppost. It's unlikely, but it's possible, and it wasn't really possible before. The way I would put it is that this idea, this historical determinism, that Russia was an empire, is an empire, will always be an empire, is an autocracy, was an autocracy, will always be an autocracy. Everywhere was an autocracy until the French Revolution. And then France went backwards and forwards. Power is contested. And the whatever ideas or set of institutions wins, that's not the only possible set of institutions. Russia has a long-standing democratic tradition too, going back to the city-state of Novgorod in the late Middle Ages. It has a very kind of international cosmopolitan tradition in St. Petersburg, and also in parts of the Russian intelligentsia. There are lots of different political forces that came into play in the 1990s. It so happened that really reactionary forces out of the KGB won, right? And it may be that that's not by chance, right? They were stronger for structural reasons. They're not stronger because Russia was always an autocracy. Putin didn't win. Yeltsin didn't appoint Putin to the next president because Peter the Great was a dictator.
Good point.
He appointed him because they were the guys with the guns who could protect him. And then they became very skilled at taking over television and dominating the narrative. In other words, all of this is contingent. It's politics. And so the decision to invade Ukraine is also politics. It's not driven by any inevitability of history, or any necessity for the Russian state to survive. In order to survive, it has to eat its neighbors. That's just not true. Russia's always been relatively poor compared to its neighbors. Going way back, right? It's off the major trade routes. Its rivers flow to the north, to the Arctic Ocean, right, into the ice. So it's been pretty useless as a part of the global trading system. And as it was industrializing and trying to find its place in that trading system, we had the Russian Revolution and the events that happened after that. And so Russia's always been relatively poor compared to the countries that it competes with in the West, and now with China too. That's true, and structurally it's important, and it doesn't inform, Russian policymakers' view on the world, but it it's a huge leap to go from there to Russia has to be an autocracy and it has to control Ukraine. But what I find really sad and frustrating. There are so many things to be sad about, but one of the frustrating things about this current situation is those conservatives who turn around and say, "See, told you Russia was evil. It still is evil. It always is evil."
It's infuriating.
They're the ones that look like they're right?
Yeah.
On a simplistic, superficial take on this thing. I used to joke. I have students come into my office every year who want to do senior theses or master's theses, and one of the generic theses is, the Russians are evil. Let me write about why. Right? This is in the American psyche. Going back to the Soviet period. And sometimes it's about manipulating oil prices. Sometimes it's about Ukraine. But it's always like the underlying premise is always, let me write a thesis about why the Russians are evil or how the Russians are evil. And I just think that's a completely misconceived way of thinking about it. It's Russian politicians, the Russian government, the Russian state at particular times behaves in particular ways that are contingent and are derived from the combination of circumstances and decisions.
Putin is not Russia. Xi Jinping is not China. Boris Johnson is not the UK, and even Joe Biden is not America. And that goes back to why I wanted to reach out to you about this, because I was seeing people talk about Ukraine with a simplicity that they would be absolutely disgusted to hear their own countries talked about. That there's this thing that is good and it's called Ukraine and it's fighting the evil empire. And it's true right now. It just happens to be true right now. But some of these same people, protested every military action the U.S. Has ever been against. And, I've tried to remind people, it hasn't gone very well, that when they say that they want to cut the U.S. military budget so that we can feed children back here, they are talking about the missiles that are now flowing to Ukraine. And I'm watching a lot of mainstream liberals and leftists become sort of neoconservative interventionists. And I'm trying to have that conversation while also saying, oh my God, yes, send all of the missiles to the Ukraine right now. But I do think you can turn the determinism around, which I won't with you also, that this historical determinism is ridiculous, and say, as long as America is projecting itself as an empire, which it clearly still is, you can imagine Putin or someone like Putin, I too don't know what's going on in his head, thinking, oh, we do have to be an empire because the alternative is humiliations at the hands of these people who made movies about us like Red Dawn and have been vilifying us for as long as there has been in America, probably, but certainly since the early 20th century. And if we don't understand that, we're not going to have a sense of what might be at stake in this war for Russia.
So this is kind of for a talk that I gave recently, I made a chart and I graphed on the one hand approval of the United States and approval of Putin. And they're basically, as approval of the United States goes up, approval of Putin goes down. And as approval of the United States goes down, approval of Putin goes up, right? And these things drive each other, right? So the big crisis that really began turning Russians off against the United States was the bombing in Belgrade during the war in Kosovo when we shelled Belgrade, and that was the first kind of post-Soviet moment where Russians in large numbers started to see the U.S. as an enemy, and that also is this moment when support for Putin and the support for nationalist forces in Russia goes up. So there's this inverse relationship between the two for sure.
And it happens in America too. I think. I think also
that's really this moment where people are talking about in terms of simplicity, and this is the biggest war we've seen. This is the largest invasion that we've seen since the Second World War. But that's only true if you don't include the invasions that the United States has done, right?
Those were not wars. Those were police actions, right, or peacekeeping, or whatever.
Whatever you think of it, it was very big.
Operation
so,
Enduring Freedom, Graham. How dare you call it a war? Was that even the right one? There were so many of these.
but it just gets lost all the time. And I mean, quite frankly, it sort of annoys me on a certain level. But it's also like if the media wants to dramatize, wants to see things that are technically not accurate in an attempt to dramatize the situation, and that will increase support for Ukraine, count me in.
Right at this moment
It bothers the small-minded academic in me, but let's face the big picture, we're in, right? Um,
yeah. The only thing I guess that I do really want to shout to the heavens right now is we have in many ways an oligarchic neoliberal society. It's not as bad. It's not as bad as in the Ukraine. And boy, am I tired of these paeans to freedom, and liberty. And Ukraine wants to be just like us. There is. It is clear to me. I guess we can start wrapping up, and you can tell me what you think. This is a broader question, but what we call liberty and democratic liberalism, there's many other parts of the world that just call it unfettered capitalism. And the story of most of the parts of the USSR and more broadly the Warsaw Pact is quote liberalism came, and the result was economic devastation and oligarchy and eventually new forms of autocracy. So it shouldn't surprise us that they have not necessarily been buying what we are selling, and I do mean literally selling. And I do want to call attention to that as people are celebrating the West right now, that a more just and fair expansion of quote the West into places like Poland and Bulgaria and Romania and Kazakhstan, which I don't know that we even tried there, might have led to a totally different outcome. And we made the economic system that created oligarchs, not Russians.
so I think that's right. Right up until the very last part about whether we made it or they made it.
Okay.
Right? And I think the other mistake that we make in the West, and especially in the United States, is we vastly overestimate our control over events in other countries.
Mhm.
The story of Russian politics in the last 20 years, the United States and the Europeans are actors in that story, but they didn't write the script, right? The script was written primarily in Russia by Russians, and in Ukraine by Ukrainians, both the good bits and the bad bits. And we're definitely important players in that story, but that Russia became an oligarchic gangster capitalism based society. Turned out to be true, and we didn't do very much to inhibit it. But I'm not sure that we caused it either.
Well, I guess let's just say this.
Nice.
And you can see if this refined version works better. Western businesses and Western oil habits and Western forms of corporate structure at least added fuel to that fire. Does that sound right?
Bits of it, right? So
Okay.
this is now we're getting really academic and kind of like
Yeah, I know. We're academics. It's what we do.
Makes an enormous difference. That's for sure. There's a debate over whether so you take Khodorkovsky, right? This is an interesting sort of discussion. Khodorkovsky becomes the richest man in Russia and the top dog of all the oligarchs, through stealing and through the monopolization through corrupt contracts with the Russian state. And then he decides that he's going to turn his business around and make it into a normal, quote unquote, Western corporation with a board of directors, and it floats on the London Stock Exchange. And so everything will then be somehow correct and above board, right? Clearly, that's not how most big corporations work, that it's all correct and above board, right? But it would be corrupt in a different kind of a way than than its existing structure in Russia, and that's one of the reasons why he was ousted. It's not the only reason. There's a lot of them, but that's one of the reasons. And so there's this interesting interaction between Western laws and corporations and domestic politics, where it's really important and where we contribute enormously to the oligarchization and corruption in all of those countries and lots of other countries around the world, is by providing safe haven for capital and investments for gangsters like Putin and his cronies.
There we go. That is where we. It's London.
London in particular, but New York, Miami, the south of France, Paris. I mean, there's Italy. All of these Putin hench persons who have property in Italy and have been complaining about it. We facilitated that, encouraged that, and made that much easier.
We benefited from it, and by we I mean our own oligarchs, not so much us.
Housing prices going up, and so you can't afford.
Yes, exactly.
Friends of mine who live in London or work in London and live in 400 miles away because they can't afford somewhere closer. That's how they benefited. If you happen to own property in London before all this, you benefited a lot.
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely an anarchist meme going around that says, so now that we have decided that the government can just take yachts and houses and companies away from billionaires, do we really have to only take it away from billionaires associated with Putin, or can we just go ahead and grab all of the mansions and all of the yachts? Is there any reason not to? And in that sense, I am not on Team West, because Team West is very clear. The idea is no, these are bad oligarchs, and they do not deserve to have yachts. But and it is true, as we keep saying, and this will be pretty much the last thing I will say, and then I'll give you the last word also. This is different. This is worse. 100% Team Ukraine right now, and supporting Putin is much worse than donating to Donald Trump or Boris Johnson. But I will say, in the era of this, if people get a taste for seizing oligarchic properties, I would not object. I would not object to that.
So if this was to lead to a serious appraisal in London and in Washington of money laundering and hiding ill-gotten gains, that would be a good thing. I would also be very surprised.
Yes, me too.
But I think you're absolutely right. The bottom line here, and what I've been trying to communicate when I've been talking with people, is that especially people on the left, right, who get a little bit hung up on the idea that Russia somehow represents an alternative, and therefore that alternative must be good, right? Russia represents an alternative, but it's really terrible as incarnated by hardline conservatives and nationalists, imperialists like Putin. And you can be for Ukraine and still be critical of the United States. You can be for Ukraine and be very critical of Russia. These things are not mutually exclusive. There are lots of nuances and details in Ukrainian politics about which we should and will, I hope, talk. This is probably not the time. Right now, we have to try and save Ukraine, or do what we can to help the Ukrainians save themselves. And we'll hash out those details later. But it's important not to be blinded by these simplicities. I agree with that 100%.
Yeah, it's tricky, and I cannot tell you how critical I was of the leftists who embraced Hugo Chavez
Right.
during the Bush administration. Putin is not Bush. He's much worse. Zelensky is not Chavez. He's much, much better. In that respect, the simplicity is in full effect. And this kind of thing that I wouldn't normally say, but by all means, make more missiles and send them to Ukraine. And even as I say that, I cringe a little bit. I had my dissertation director on the show, and I still